All right, we are back now with the sixth video, number 6 of the Red Orchestra 2 SDK tutorial series. Had a couple questions posed to me this week. I thought they would be a good basis for a video. I will try to keep this one a little shorter than the previous few. I know they do start to get a little long and probably boring. The main thing I'm going to be covering today is how to set up foliage layers on your map, so you can get grass and things like that growing out of the ground. Really helps to give a nice environment feel to the map. We'll also be discussing how to set up wind on the map so the grass will sway naturally, more or less. And also, the first thing I'm actually going to start with is the height fog, which I didn't mention on previous videos. This is more of a UDK thing, but I figured almost every single map is going to have fog, so I figured I'd add it to this series. It's fairly easy. There are 2 ways to add fog. Normally, I'll show you the 2 ways I do it anyways. So the older, outdated way to do it, it still works, would just be to grab this height fog actor out of your actor classes tab in the content browser. You go down to info, open that up, and then you'd go to height fog. If I right click, I can hit add height fog. You get this weird turkey dinosaur head looking thing. If you remember, the destructible info had the same icon. Not quite sure what it is, a raptor maybe. But we can just set this as high as we want. Quick shortcut to turn fog off and on is the F key. F is in Frank. With this older method, we would add it. We could raise it up high. There's going to be this distinctive line where it ends. If you're down in it, you might not notice really. You could hit the settings for it, change the density, things like this to make it denser, darker. That's kind of the older way to do it. Some of the early Red Orchestra 2 maps did use this way, this approach. What I like to do now, use the exponential height fog. So we add this the same way. You may not even be able to really notice the difference, but we'll add it the same way. The difference with the exponential height fog, it gives you a lot more options, and we don't get this sudden drop off. I will link a tutorial, or I'm sorry, a reference website down in the description that really gets into depth with the exponential height fog. But like before, we can adjust the density. So I'm going to make this a little bit denser. And this has 2 different colors we can adjust, as well as the fall off, things like that. We can decide how much it falls off the higher it gets, so we don't get that distinctive line of fog's done, fog's over. So we can set it like this. It defaults to this yellow light. A lot of times I want to set this to the color maybe of the light I'm using up here, which we had that like pinker color. And then you have also the opposite light color. So you have the light coming in, and then you have the opposite light color, which kind of gives you the color you're going to see when you look away from the light. So you can play with these values to really get the color and the lighting tweaked for your map. The best part about it, it's easily adjustable, and changing the fog and things like that won't break the light map. So it's something you can always build the light, see how it looks. It's too dense. I can tone down the density. I don't have to mess around with rebuilding light. I believe if you change the colors, though, you are going to have to rebuild light. But it's something you can play with. Like I said, I'll link a little guide below. It gives a lot more in depth. But that's something that really helps to set the environment. One other key setting in this is the start distance. So we have it set to 0. If you have a completely exterior map, it's all set outdoors, this isn't a big deal. Maybe it's a personal preference for me. When I have a map that has interior buildings and things like this, maybe a large room, I don't necessarily want to see fog halfway across the room forming. So that's where I would kick up the start distance. 400 is usually about as low as I'll go, and all that adjusts is the area around the player. I'm not going to see fog, so it looks a little more realistic. You're in fog, you don't necessarily see it till it starts to kind of stack up the further away it is. So that's something you can play with too. just as a personal preference. But those are the main settings I would adjust on the exponential height fog, and you can get it as subtle or as thick as you want, just depending on these settings. So we'll move on from there and get going with the foliage layers. All right, the next thing I want to touch on would be to set up foliage layers on your terrain. These are things like, typically it's grass, weeds, some sort of plant life that you would see growing on the grass. It kind of helps to break up the terrain, as you can see here. Even with our two different layers, it's very plain, and obviously it's flat. We didn't do too much in the way of sculpting it. But there are, as usual, there's more than one way to do this. There are two main ways that I know of to add foliage layers to the terrain. First, I'm going to cover the way I almost exclusively use. I will briefly touch on another approach you can do to kind of keep the foliage and the terrain layer itself independent of each other. But let me show you what I would typically do. I usually find this grass layer I'm going to use. And this is what I'm going to add the foliage to, this grassy area. So when I add the grass to it, it'll appear where the grass appears. It won't appear where the dirt appears. And that'll be, since my grass, if you recall, was the base layer for my entire height map, it will cover the entire map except where it's uncovered, I guess you could call it, or overridden by the dirt. You can add a foliage layer to any one of your terrain layers in this stack, and they would just they would hold their same priorities that they do here. So let me just show you the way I typically do it. I'm going to go to my content browser. If I can get my mouse to work. I'm going to type in the name of my map here. And what we are, let's see here. I've already searched for some grasses. Before you do this, you definitely want to load all your packages because there are just a lot of grasses. A lot of the Rising Storm grasses are a little bit better than the older Red Orchestra 2 grasses. But I'm just going to, this is kind of a shortcut. I have problems sometimes when I'm opening up the maps package from it crashing or I guess overwhelming my computer. But a little shortcut I like to use, I just click on some random package. I want to bring up terrain layers, or I'm sorry, terrain materials. So I select that. What I'm going to do now, I've got terrain materials selected, and I'm going to go to my maps package. So if you recall, we call this TE test map. Well, some of you may not need to go through these hoops and jump through these hoops to get this to work, but this is typically what I do. So now I click on my test map package, which is my maps package, and I've got terrain materials already selected, so these two are going to pop up automatically. I've got the grass and the dirt. I'm going to double click on the grass, and I have foliage meshes here. I'm going to add one. It's going to be blank, and I'm going to go back to, what I'm going to do is just search all grasses, and you're going to search static meshes, and you just want to search all packages here. And here we go. Here's a bunch. So you can see a lot of these. One thing I really want to kind of touch on when I'm doing this is the impact this could have on the performance of your map. If you just dump a ton of foliage, maybe high poly grass onto the map, something like this, you can see this is almost 4,000 tries for this particular grass. You are going to bog down people's computers when they try to play this, maybe even your own. That's just hundreds of thousands of tries and polys that the game engine needs to render while you're running across the map and doing whatever else. So a couple things to keep in mind here. I typically go for the lower, I guess, more efficient meshes. As you can see, this one's almost 4,000 tries. We got one here, 700. These are from the older packages for the Red Orchestra. Things have kind of come a long way in a few years, and the Rising Storm guys really got some really high quality static meshes in general, but really with the grass as well at a low, very efficient. You can see this one has 65 tries, so 65 compared to 4,000, obviously I typically like to use the rising storm grass. Maybe you can even make your own if you're some sort of 3D modeler. But you're going to pick your grass here. You're going to plug it in to the static mesh. The density is by default 0, which means it's not going to appear. And densities are always integers on here. So there's not a lot of tweaking. You either get it on or it's off. If you start kicking up the density to 2, 3, 4, you're going to get, the grass is going to be so thick you're going to lose it. It's going to be overkill. But usually I just start off with 1 to start. Now as you can see, it instantly showed up here. Wherever I have the grass, I also now have this grass mesh. It's a mouthful. But over the dirt, it's not assigned to the dirt. It's only assigned to the grass. Now, as you can see, it also kind of blooms as we go. And this is a constant complaint for, I believe, all Unreal games. Certainly this game. A lot of the Western Front maps, people complain. And it's kind of a trade-off. How far out do you want the grass to appear as the player moves across the map, compared with, I'm here, someone's 100 meters away laying in the grass, they think they're hidden, I can clearly see them, and you have to kind of weigh that in with performance and things like that. Because if we were to set this to just draw the entire map's worth of grass no matter where I'm at, the computer's going to bog down really badly. So once we have our density set, just to show you the difference, if I kick it up to 2, it is going to be thicker. You get 3 and 4. It's just triple the density and whatnot. I like to keep this around 1 if I can, because as we draw this grass out further, you're going to notice it's going to pull a lot more and render a lot more polygons in the game. So the next setting I like to mess with, we have the density, we have the draw radius, and then we have the thinning radius. So we got it, the default's 1024. A lot of times, what I would suggest to you is crack open one of the vanilla maps, especially the Rising Storm maps that really handled the grass a lot better, and just see what their settings are. And a lot of times you can even copy their settings, copy their mesh, see what they use, kind of adjust it for your purposes if you need to. But the default's 1000. A lot of times you can get, depending on what static mesh you end up using, you can push this up to 3000. We'll do 2400 for now. And then the minimum thinning radius, I typically like to adjust down, let's see here, a little bit below what this is. So if I got 2400 and I want 2000 here. And a lot of this is just trial and error. What you typically would want to do is adjust it, then hop into the map, run around, and just see how much popping you notice. Do I notice the grass at distance is not there, then boom, suddenly it's there. The transition radius as well. You can see the tooltips are enabled for this. This says how far away will the mesh cease to blend or scale in. So we can adjust this too. This might save a little bit of rendering. Or we can keep it the same as our draw distance. So it was set to 0. So this will help a lot too. But as you can see, we've got our density set to 1. This grass is pretty thick. And as far as we can see, especially if we're down at the level a human would be standing, you really can't notice where it stops drawing it. And it's much less noticeable when I don't have it highlighted and selected like that. So if I go up in the air, you can see how it kind of comes in and out. These are the things you're going to want to play with in your map. All right, and a couple other settings we can talk about. The seed. This is just you can put in any number here, and it just changes the way the grass lays. So it's just a random number. A lot of times, maybe you just leave it at 1. Sometimes you can have more than one foliage. So we could even add another one of these and use a different mesh. You probably want to give them different seeds so they kind of don't sit on each other depending on the type of grass used. I wouldn't always recommend using more than one. Just kind of depends when you play around with the performance. Here at the end of the video, I will briefly touch on just kind of how I do some basic troubleshooting to determine maybe a map's performance. I like to compare it to the vanilla maps, especially the ones that maybe run well, and try to shoot for something similar. But we'll touch on that here in just a little bit. Some of the other things you want to adjust: the alpha map threshold is the setting that shows how much this bleeds over when we have two different terrain layers here. So we got the dirt, we got the grass. If I adjust the alpha map threshold, which I guess is default 0, as you can see, it's going to give this buffer. So I'd say 1's probably way too high. 0 isn't bad, depending on, maybe you have this leading up to like a road or something. You don't want it to get real close. It really just depends. Maybe you just make this 0.2. So as you can see, it kind of thins it out the closer it gets to the dirt, but it doesn't necessarily have this blank area between. The slope rotation, I know we added a hill somewhere. The slope rotation will adjust how this grass lays. You've probably seen this. There's a lot of custom maps that don't have this adjusted, and you can see I've got this grass mesh here that sticks out over the edge because my alpha map threshold is 0.2. I can adjust that to a higher number. Let's just make it 1. Oh, I'm changing the wrong one. Slope right there. It was 0. Now it's 1. And as you can see, it lays much better. If you have really sharp curves, it's going to poke out. But this right here lays a lot better on the hill. So that's how you would adjust that. If you have a lot of steep terrain, things like that, maybe we would even want to do something where we didn't want the grass on there. So we could come here with our dirt painting tool and just remove the grass from here by overriding it with the dirt. As you can see, I've got it. It's a dirt hilltop or something like that now. You can play with this too, just to kind of thin it out, and that's how you would remove the grass from there. And that's kind of the benefit here of having it associated with the base level. Maybe in an actual map, you wouldn't want the base level associated with foliage terrain because you're getting that terrain rendered over the entire map. And it culls out at a distance. It only draws it out to a certain distance, but maybe for good practice, you'd want to not do it on the base layer and have the base layer be something a little bit more simple. Just something to think about as you try this. One last important setting, the scale of it. Right now, you can see the grass is the same size everywhere, no matter where you fly around on the map. We can adjust these scales, and they're all set to 1. A lot of times I like to put 1. Depending on the model of grass you're using, some scale a little bit better than others. Maybe put minimum to 0.6, and you could kick the max up maybe to 1.5. This is an easy way. You're using the same amount of polygons here, but by slightly increasing the size of the grass, it looks thicker, it looks fuller, and it gives a more random look. So it's not all 1.5, some of it's 0.6, some of it's 1.5. It's going to fall somewhere in that range. You can also do the same thing with the max uniform scale. If I wanted to just tone this down a little bit, and you can play with these values. Like I said, a very good reference would be to check out the vanilla maps, but I can thin things out, thicken things out. It really depends. The biggest factor is which one of these models you end up picking, which one of these meshes. See, I can switch this out, and it's going to, look much different. Blood grass, I don't think it was ever meant to be that thick. We got another one here. This is a similar grass, maybe a little bit shorter. A lot of these are real similar. I think I used this grass on a map before. This one's a little bit taller, but yet thinner, and you can just kind of play with it. If you find a grass on one of the other maps you like, just open it up in the SDK and see what it's called. It'll tell you. This probably isn't one you'd want to use very much. It's a little bit thin, I guess. But anyways, that's how you would go about setting up the foliage layer to associate it with a terrain layer. So we covered the first way of adding the foliage, and as you can see, when you do add that foliage layer to the grass, it if you click the little drop down arrow, you will see it appear down here as an actual foliage layer. The other way I'm going to show you, this isn't something I typically use, would be to just add it's called a deco layer to the terrain itself, and it's its own layer. It has nothing to do with the grass or the dirt, and you can paint it anywhere you want. The downside of this, I believe that it won't be affected by wind, which this layer will, and I'll show you that here next. And I just feel like it's a little bit more demanding on the engine. I feel like this approach that I showed you the first time around is more efficient when you're trying to optimize things. So let me just show you real quick the easiest way to add it. I'm just going to double click my terrain or click the terrain and then hit the F4 key. Brings up my terrain properties. If I squeeze down here to deco layers, I've got none right now, or 0, got none. I can add one, and it's blank, but it's a default. And what I'm going to do is I can name it if I'd like. So let's just call this grass deco. And I'm going to add a decoration. It has none. What I have to pick here is a static mesh component factory. And then open up that factory, and this is where I'm going to plug in the grass I'm going to use. So I'm going to use something completely different so it doesn't look, let's use that weird cattail thing, just so we can tell the two apart. So now I've added the static mesh, and then I also need to check to make sure my density is set, which it is, but it's a very small number. I'm going to set it to 1. And it would appear that this one actually allows for a float rather than just an integer. That I never noticed before, but let's see how that turns out here in a minute. Once I've got that set up, I'm going to open up my terrain editing tools, and as you can see now, I have a completely independent layer that's called Grass Deco that I added. Let's see if I can click this arrow down. There it is, the static mesh component factories where we added, I guess that's called Congo grass. So I can paint this on just like in the earlier tutorials where we painted on the dirt. Now I can just paint on this particular grass independent of where anything else. So I just come down here. If you remember, hold down Control and left click. Now I can put this wherever I want. I can even paint it on top of this. I can put it on the dirt. It doesn't matter. And just like the other settings, we won't repeat them all. We can get min scale, maximum scale, so I can blow them all up. Just for good measure, I want to try this with like a float variable. I guess it does work. Okay, that's interesting. I'll probably have a random seed, so as you see that moves it around. And so this is something you can try as well. Some people, maybe you're in a position where you absolutely want to keep the foliage independent of the actual terrain layers, then this would be the way to go. In my opinion, it's a little outdated, and I don't really think it's used too much on any of the more current maps. But that's another option for you to do. And I'm actually going to we'll leave it for testing. But the next thing I'm going to cover is adding wind and getting this grass to move around a little bit. And the next thing I want to discuss is adding wind to the map. As you can see here, the grass is just kind of there. It's not moving. Most of the grass meshes will react to a wind actor when you add it to the map. So real quick, we're going to go back to our Actor Classes tab. Same place we went for our fog, back to the Info heading. Open that up if it's not, and grab Wind Directional Source. So I'm going to click on that, right-click anywhere on the map, add Wind Directional Source here. We get that goofy dinosaur head turkey thing again. Just put that wherever. It doesn't matter as long as it's somewhere on the map. And if we open it up, we'll just use the default settings, but all the settings you're going to need, there's quite a bit of crap in here. The Wind Directional Source settings. So we're going to leave all these default for now. If I click on my Real Time button here, this is going to bring the map to life here in the 3D viewport. As you can see, it's already animated the grass. So the grass is already reacting to the wind. You can adjust the wind itself. Typically, just depending on the grass, I might tone this down a little bit unless I had a very windy environment. I believe the last map I had, just I wanted a subtle movement to the grass, but I didn't really necessarily want it flipping back and forth really fast. So I usually keep both settings under 0.5 or at 0.5. You can play with these. Different grass meshes might react differently to different settings of the wind here. The other thing you can adjust, there's a sway setting in the grass itself, which you can lower, kick up, kick down to either reduce or increase the effect of the wind on it. If you'll note, though, the deco layer grass we added is not moving. And I do not believe there is any setting for sway in the deco layer itself, so you're kind of stuck there. That's why I have the opinion that this is kind of an outdated way to add foliage to the map, because it really doesn't react to things. So that is the main way to add the wind. It just kind of brings the map to life a little bit. Subtle breeze makes things feel, I guess, a little bit more real. And then our dramatic fog there, just feel like you're walking through the meadow. All right, that kind of concludes what I wanted to cover here. I'm going to briefly touch on next how I go about testing a map, maybe to optimize it or compare it to some of the stock maps and just its performance, hopefully to predict how it will perform on other computers beyond my own. Okay, typically I would do this in the game itself, but for our purposes today, playing in the SDK will work just fine, as I demonstrated. What I like to do is, you see our grass is all here. We can see it. You can see as I run across, this is the dirt area. The lighting's not built on this map, so it's kind of hard to see. But you'll notice how the grass kind of appears there at a distance. Normally probably wouldn't have this massive wide open area on your map or flat terrain, so a lot of that, these values might be just fine for an actual map. But as you can see, the foliage grass we have drawn on here as well. So what I like to do, just to kind of evaluate what's going on, I guess, under the hood, there are a bunch of UDK commands you can use. I'm going to use stat engine, and you just either hit the tilde key or F3, type in stat space engine, and you're going to get a bunch of statistics up here in the left. The ones I'm most concerned about here are, and I can't mouse over them, I guess, while I'm in here, but oh, here we are. Yeah, this will work. The ones I'm most concerned about here are both foliage instances, which is showing me how many instances of that grass are popping up in any particular view. So we're hitting around 1,000 here, which isn't insane, but you know, that could be a little bit lower. We had that grass, if you remember, drawing out to 2,400 UUs, and we have nothing. The map's completely flat, so there's nothing to block its view. Directly related to the foliage instances are the static mesh tries. So of those, this is all the static mesh tries of every static mesh in the game, but as you know, in this level, we don't really have many static meshes, so the majority of these are coming from the grass. So we have 1,000 instances of the grass, and you know, however many of those are coming from the static meshes of the grass itself gives you an idea of what you're seeing. So let me click back into the game. And I can close that, it just makes it a little easier to see when it's got that black background. If I look, let's say here, I look straight down at the ground, I've got foliage instances to 3 because I'm not looking at anything. They only render when you can see them. So I'm looking down at foliage instances, 0 now. My static mesh tries are 816. As soon as I look up at this grass, you can see the numbers skyrocket. Foliage instances, 1,800 with my tries at, I'm sorry, yes, okay, 2,800 now as I walk into this thick grass, and my static mesh tries shoot up significantly. 82,000. So, sorry, I'm trying to read this and walk at the same time. It's kind of silly. As we move around here, though, you'll notice if I go back to this dirt area, things go down a little bit. So the main thing I'm trying to get to you, once you start to kind of play with the map, I'd build the lighting, I'd cook the map, and I'd play it in the game and run these commands, take a few screenshots, okay, or how high can I get this number? The static mesh tries, it's about 400,000 here. Snap a screenshot. Then maybe I'd go over here. All right, we got this deco layer, which I don't think is real efficient. As you can see here with the deco layer, I'm going up to, I don't know, 100,000 here without the grass, blah, blah, blah. Take a picture here. This is a relatively low area, and I'm getting a lot less meshes, and if you had your FPS counter on, your frames would probably shoot up here as well. So what I would do is take some snapshots of your map, maybe some of the more areas where you're getting bogged down, compare those, then go into a vanilla map, do the exact same thing, and just kind of compare numbers. And over the last couple years, I've noticed some of the biggest hogs on a map itself are the foliage layers. You can really bog down and ruin the map by just adding way too much inefficient foliage. And if you get somebody that's trying to play it on a computer that's 2, 3, 4 years old, they're going to be getting 12 frames a second or something, and no one's going to want to play it. So something to keep in mind. I will link an Imager album I have taken where I compare some Rising Storm maps and some Western Front maps. It was kind of an eye-opener when I started doing this research, I guess, to see where things were getting bogged down and what was affecting the draw calls the most, which mainly what I found is the static mesh grass that had been added to the maps. One other note to keep in mind, let me get out of this, another big factor to the density and thickness of the grass is the tessellation. If you recall, we changed the tessellation when we wanted to add the trench. That way we could get the opening in the trench the right size. So by changing the tessellation, we will also be increasing. The tessellation is increased, therefore the number of instances of grass are greatly increased. So something else to keep in mind, if you have a larger map with a smaller or a very high tessellation, you're going to need to be very careful about how far out the grass renders and things like that. As always, if you have any questions or something doesn't make sense or you have a particular problem with anything involving the SDK, please comment below. I'll be more than happy to either research it or help you try to figure it out or explain it in a future tutorial. Thank you very much for bearing with me here, and I hope you have a great day. See you next time. Thank you.